She stood across that mediation table like she hadn't spent 3 years treating him like a subscription service she forgot to cancel. Silk blouse, pearl earrings, the whole production. And then her attorney started talking about sacrifices. Sacrifices. Kenneth didn't move. Didn't blink. Just opened the folder. 3 folders, actually. Every transfer. Every receipt. Every lie. $71,400 documented in ink, while she was shipping designer bags to her sister's apartment, so he wouldn't see them. The mediator read the transcript out loud. He doesn't know anything. He's just my walking wallet. The room went dead quiet. And Selina, who had rehearsed every word of this performance, finally ran out of script. You want the truth? Her voice cracked open. You made it too easy. You were so busy being enough for both of us, that I never had to be enough for myself. Kenneth looked at her. Just looked. Then he closed the folder. Because some confessions aren't an apology. They're just the moment a person finally tells you exactly who they've been the whole time.
5:03 a.m. Monday. Atlanta hadn't woken up yet. The streets were still that particular shade of dark that belongs only to people who have no choice but to be awake in it. Kenneth Osei was one of those people. Had been for 3 years. He was standing at the kitchen doorway, thermos in his right hand, the one with the dented side he'd never bothered replacing. Work bag already on his shoulder. Left foot already past the threshold. He was 12 seconds from being gone, from being safely out the door and into the gray Atlanta morning where he could just be a man walking to a job instead of a husband standing in a house that was starting to feel like a job too. Then Selina's voice came through the bedroom door. Not the bedroom door he thought was closed. The bedroom door that was open. Just enough. Olivia, I'm telling you. Her laugh landed soft and easy, the kind you only use when you're comfortable. Really comfortable. He doesn't know anything. The man is literally just a walking wallet. Kenneth didn't move. His hand tightened on the thermos. He's out there right now thinking he's some kind of hero. Another laugh. Lighter this time. Almost fond. Almost. You should see the spreadsheet he made. Color-coded. He's got columns, Olivia. Columns. The words sat in the air between the doorframe and Kenneth's chest. Columns. He'd spent 4 hours building that spreadsheet. Sat at that same kitchen table she was probably looking at right now. Made sure every payment was time-stamped, every transfer documented, every dollar accounted for. He'd even added a progress bar across the top that turned greener as the debt went down. He'd been proud of it. Showed it to her once. Expecting maybe not celebration, but acknowledgement. She'd kissed him on the cheek and said he was so thorough. He'd thought she meant it as a compliment. He stood there and let the silence of his own stupidity fill the kitchen. That bag from last week, Selina continued. The Tory Birch? $870. He thinks Maya sent it for my birthday. A pause, the sound of sheets shifting. And girl, I got approved for another card last month. $13,800 already on it. He's sitting there thinking we're almost out of the woods. Almost out of the woods. Kenneth had told her that exact phrase 11 days ago, standing right where he was standing now. He'd done the math, showed her the numbers, told her they were making real progress. She'd pressed her forehead against his shoulder and said she was grateful. He'd believed it so completely that he'd felt a warmth that he hadn't let himself feel in months. The kind that makes you think maybe the hard part is almost over. The hard part was not over. The hard part was apparently the whole thing. He stood there for 30 more seconds, counting his own breaths, listening to Selina laugh at something Olivia said on the other end of the line, listening to her sound genuinely happy in a way he couldn't remember hearing in a long time, and understanding for the first time that the reason he couldn't remember it was because that version of her had never been directed at him. Then he shifted his grip on the thermos, opened the front door, stepped out, closed it behind him, gently. Because that's who Kenneth Osei was. Even then, even at 5:03 in the morning when the ground had just cracked open under his feet, he was the kind of man who closed the door gently. The air outside hit him like a correction. November in Atlanta. Cold enough to matter, not cold enough to excuse him from anything. He walked 2 blocks before he remembered he hadn't put his jacket on. 3 blocks before he noticed he was still carrying the thermos in the hand he didn't usually use. 4 blocks before anything that resembled rational thought started pushing through the noise. He stopped at the intersection of Candler Park Drive and McClendon Avenue. Traffic lights swinging in the wind, red, the only color for miles. A walking wallet. That's what she'd called him. Not to his face. That's the part that made it worse, actually. If she'd said it to his face, it would have been a fight. Fights have rules. Fights have exits. What he'd just heard was the version of Selena that existed when she thought he wasn't there to hear it. And that version was comfortable. That version was laughing. $13,800. He pulled the number apart in his head, rolled it around, tried to find an angle where it made sense. Some version of events where he'd somehow misunderstood, misread the whole situation. He was good at giving people the benefit of the doubt. He'd been told that before, usually by people who meant it as a compliment. He turned left, kept walking. Northbridge Distribution was 40 minutes on foot. He knew because he'd done it 3 times a week for almost a year now, leaving the car home to save on gas, telling himself it was practical, telling himself every dollar counted, telling himself a lot of things at 5 a.m. when there was no one around to confirm or deny them. 7 months ago. That's when he first noticed. Not the debt. He'd known about the debt since 3 weeks after their wedding, when Selena sat down across from him at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her and told him the number. $119,000. He'd heard it. He'd processed it. And then he'd done something that he now understood was either the bravest or the most catastrophic decision of his adult life. He'd said they would figure it out together. What he'd noticed 7 months ago was different. It was smaller. A credit card envelope from a company he didn't recognize, addressed to Selena, that she'd grabbed off the counter before he could register the logo. Junk mail, she'd said, already moving toward the recycling. He'd let it go. Then there was a package from an address in Dunwoody he didn't recognize, dropped off on a Tuesday when he was at work, that Selena said was something Maya ordered and sent to their place by accident. Then there was the budget discrepancy. $340. Every month, like clockwork, coming out of somewhere he couldn't pin down through the categories they'd built together. He hadn't said anything. He'd started writing things down instead, because Kenneth Osei had been managing inventory at Northbridge Distribution for 14 years. And the first thing you learn in inventory management is that when the numbers don't match, you don't confront the discrepancy. You document it. You build the record. You wait until you have something that can't be explained away. And so that's what he did. Quietly. Methodically. In a way that Selena, who knew him as the man who color-coded their debt spreadsheet, probably would have recognized as completely on brand if she'd been paying attention to him at all. 3 folders. He kept them in the locked drawer of the small desk, in the corner of the living room. The one Selena called your little workspace in a tone that made it sound slightly ridiculous. A grown man needing a corner to do his thinking in. He'd never told her about the folders. He'd never told anyone about the folders. Folder 1 was navy blue. Every bank transfer he'd made over 3 years, chronological order, each one screenshotted with the date and reference number visible. $71,400. That's what the total came to. He knew it the way you know a number you've stared at long enough that it stops looking like a number and starts looking like a fact of life. Folder 2 was dark red. Credit card statements from the accounts he knew about, the ones he had access to, plus photographs he'd taken of envelope fronts that came in the mail from companies he didn't recognize. 5 envelopes in 7 months. 5 different addresses on the return labels. He hadn't been able to open them. He hadn't needed to. The envelopes themselves were enough. Folder 3 was black. He'd felt the worst about building Folder 3, because Folder 3 was the one that required him to acknowledge what he was actually doing. Not protecting himself from a mistake, documenting a pattern. Screenshots from Selena's Instagram and Facebook, things she'd posted publicly, check-ins at spas in Buckhead and restaurants in Midtown and boutiques in Virginia Highland during afternoons she'd told him she was at the office or running quick errands, outfits that cost more than he could account for. A weekend trip to Savannah with Olivia that she'd mentioned casually and explained away as something Olivia had paid for. A gift, don't worry about it. He'd felt like a bad husband building that folder. He understood now that the folder was the only honest thing in the apartment. He'd saved a phone number 4 months ago. Timothy Clark, Clark & Associates Family Law, a firm in Buckhead with a website that was clean and direct and didn't use the word justice even once, which he'd taken as a sign of someone who dealt in reality. He hadn't called. He'd sat with the number in his contacts for 4 months, opening it occasionally like a door he wasn't ready to walk through, then putting his phone away and going back to his spreadsheet and telling himself they were making progress. They were not making progress. This morning's conversation had confirmed that in a way that left no room for charitable interpretation. He got to Northbridge at 5:48, 12 minutes before his shift. He sat in the parking lot for 7 of those minutes and did nothing except breathe slowly in through his nose and out through his mouth, which was something Carol Lee would later tell him was instinct, that some people's nervous systems just know what to do when the floor drops out. He didn't know that yet. He just knew that breathing slowly was the only thing that felt manageable, and manageable was what he needed right now. He was going to call Timothy Clark at lunch. He was going to walk in there and do his shift first, because that's what you do. When you are Kenneth Osei, when you were raised by Clarence Osei, who worked 2 jobs and never once left his family in doubt about where he stood, when you learned early that your word was a thing you kept even when it cost you, you go in and you do your shift, even when your whole morning has just rearranged itself around something you can't unknow. Especially then, George White was standing at the loading bay entrance when Kenneth came around the corner, which was not unusual, because George was always standing somewhere when Kenneth arrived, arms crossed, expression that of a man permanently unconvinced by whatever the universe was currently trying to sell him. George White was 6'3", and built like the kind of person who had been carrying heavy things without complaint since adolescence, which was exactly what he was. He'd been at Northbridge 4 years longer than Kenneth. He knew every sound the building made, every tendency of every employee on his floor, and approximately 90% of everything that happened within a 100-foot radius of wherever he was standing. He looked at Kenneth once, just once. "You look like somebody ran over your dog." His voice was flat, stating a fact. "Didn't sleep enough. You don't sleep enough every day. Today's different." Kenneth looked at him. George looked back. The loading bay hummed behind them. "I need to make a call at lunch, somewhere private." George uncrossed his arms. That was all. Just uncrossed his arms and said, "Break room B. I'll make sure nobody wanders in. No questions." That was the thing about George White. He had a finely calibrated sense of when asking questions was useful and when it was just noise. Most people in Kenneth's life made noise. George did not make noise. Kenneth went to work. The morning shift was an exercise in physicality replacing thought, which was almost helpful. 2 delivery trucks needed unloading before 9 a.m. Pallets to organize. A manifest discrepancy in Bay 4 that required him to actually count 47 boxes individually, because the scanner had given up on life sometime around 7:30. His body moved through all of it on autopilot, while his mind kept circling back to Selena's voice. The way she'd laughed. Not the content of what she'd said, though that was plenty bad enough. The laugh, light and easy and comfortable. The laugh of someone who had been keeping a secret for a long time and had stopped being even slightly tense about it. He thought about 3 weeks after their wedding. He thought about it a lot. Actually, had been thinking about it in pieces for 7 months. The way you return to a moment you need to re-examine when you've stopped protecting it with sentiment. Selena sitting across from him at the kitchen table, her hands folded, that particular angle of her chin that meant she was about to say something she'd been rehearsing. He'd thought at the time that she was scared, genuinely scared. He'd thought she was being brave, in the particular way that people are brave when they're telling a truth that could end something. $119,000. He'd felt the number land. He'd taken her hands. He'd said they would figure it out together. And he'd meant it completely, not from naivety, but from a specific kind of conviction that had been built into him by watching his parents survive things that should have broken them and come out on the other side still standing together. Selena had cried. Real tears, or what he'd had no reason at the time to classify as anything other than real tears. She'd said she had a problem she was working on. Said she'd been to 2 months of financial counseling. Said she was committed to changing. Said she needed someone who would stay. He had stayed. He'd sold the motorcycle 18 months ago. The Honda Shadow he'd spent 3 years paying off, and then 6 months actually riding before the math made him put it in an ad. He'd watched it leave in a stranger's truck on a Sunday afternoon, and told himself it was just a thing. Things could be replaced when the important stuff was settled. He'd told Selena that, and she'd hugged him and said she didn't deserve him. Looking back now, she had not been wrong about that specific point. Break room B was empty when Kenneth walked in at noon. True to his word, George had done something to discourage traffic, probably simply stood near the doorway looking like a geological formation until people decided to eat elsewhere. Kenneth closed the door, sat down on one of the folding chairs, put his phone on the table and looked at the number he'd been carrying in his contacts for 4 months. Timothy Clark, Clark and Associates Family Law. He pressed call before he could have another conversation with himself about it. 3 rings. A woman answered, professional and unhurried, Clark and Associates. He said he wanted to schedule a consultation with Mr. Clark about divorce and about the recovery of funds paid toward a spouse's premarital debt. A pause. Brief. Mr. Clark has availability Wednesday at noon. I only have my lunch hour. Noon to 1. This Wednesday 12 to 1 o'clock. Will that work? Kenneth looked at the blank wall of break room. Be Wednesday 4 days. Yes. He sat with the phone in his hand for a moment after hanging up. 4 days. 4 days of going home and saying the right things and watching Selena move through their apartment and not letting any of what he knew show on his face. 4 days of being the husband she expected him to be, which in her private accounting was apparently an ATM with a commute and a feelings problem. He could do 4 days. He'd already been doing it for 7 months without knowing it was a countdown. That evening, Tuesday, he drove the rideshare shift he'd already committed to, which is the kind of decision that tells you something about a person. He could have cancelled. He had a perfectly adequate reason to sit in the apartment he'd co-signed for. With a woman who was apparently treating his sacrifice like a subscription service she hadn't agreed to cancel. Instead, he drove. Because he'd said he'd drive. Because the rating mattered. Because $43 after fees and gas is still $43. And for 3 years he'd been a man for whom $43 meant something. His third fare was Brian Thompson. Brian Thompson, who he'd known since sophomore year at Georgia State, who had gone into accounting and wore blazers ironically, and still texted Kenneth memes at 11 o'clock at night, like they were 22. Brian got in the car and immediately stared at the app screen longer than necessary. Is that your name on here? Yes. Your driving lift, yes you. Kenneth Osei, our driving lift on a Tuesday night. Brian, I'm just processing. Process quietly. Brian processed for approximately 45 seconds, which was generous of him. Then, you, working on it. How many jobs are you doing right now? 5. A longer silence, the kind that meant Brian was deciding whether to push. He was an accountant. He was very good at calculating risk. Does Selena know? She knows I work a lot. That's not what I asked. Kenneth kept his eyes on I-20. Buckhead to Decatur. 11 minutes. I know it's not what you asked. Brian looked out the passenger window, Atlanta streaming past in stripes of light. He didn't push again, because Brian Thompson was also, when it mattered, the kind of person who understood that some things needed to move at the speed the other person could handle. What he said, right before he got out, very quietly, you're the most reliable person I know. I just want to make sure someone's being reliable for you. Kenneth thought about that the rest of the shift. Wednesday came the way things come when you've been waiting for them. Slow and then all at once. He did the morning warehouse shift on almost no sleep, which had become so routine at this point that his body had simply adapted, producing a kind of dull, competent energy that got the work done without making him feel like a person. He answered questions. He signed off on 3 manifests. He told Jerome in the loading dock that yes, the pallet wrap was in Bay 2. No, it had not moved. It was in the same place it had been for 11 months. Bay 2, Jerome, Bay 2. At 11:47 he clocked out for lunch. He did not go to the coffee shop where he usually did his data entry shift during lunch. He drove to Buckhead. The offices of Clark and Associates occupied the 9th floor of a building on Peachtree Road that looked exactly like a building where decisions got made. No fountain in the lobby. No statement art. Just clean lines and the specific kind of quiet that comes from carpet that costs more than it looks like it does. Timothy Clark was already at the conference room table when Kenneth was shown in. 58 years old. The den so new walnut. Tok moi tio katsat gongang king gong mong mo tai tan. Suit sang dump new dame dung chin bobian, kavat burgundy, khom komot nep nyan, khom fo chung, khom tio tuzi. The kind of put together that says I have been doing this long enough that I stopped performing it and started just being it. He didn't stand immediately. He looked at Kenneth first, a brief, thorough assessment, the kind that takes 2 seconds and covers everything. Then he stood, Shook hands once firm. You have 55 minutes, Mr. Osei. Let's use them. Kenneth sat down, opened his bag, placed 3 folders on the table, one navy, one dark red, one black. My wife had $119,000 in credit card debt before we got married. He said it the way he'd been practicing saying it on the drive over. Just facts. No adjectives he'd have to walk back later. She disclosed it 3 weeks after the wedding. I've been working 5 jobs over 3 years and paid down $71,400 of it. Monday morning, I overheard her tell a friend that I'm her walking wallet, and she has another card I don't know about with $13,800 on it. I also found luxury merchandise hidden in our garage under a tarp. He paused. I want to file for divorce, and I want to know if I can recover what I paid. Timothy had not changed expression during any of that. He opened the navy folder, turned pages at a pace that suggested he was reading, actually reading, not skimming. 90 seconds passed. You work inventory management. 14 years. You keep records like a forensic accountant. I keep records like someone who's been doing this job long enough to know that the paperwork always matters more than the conversation. Timothy looked up at that, and something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like recognition. Georgia is an equitable distribution state, not community property. The distinction matters. Debt she accumulated before marriage is in principle hers alone. But, he held up one finger. Not for emphasis, as a structure. The way someone holds up a finger when they're building an argument piece by piece. If you can demonstrate that you paid the debt under conditions of active misrepresentation, if you can show that she promised to change, promised to stop accumulating debt, while simultaneously and knowingly creating new debt and hiding it from you, then we have a viable fraud-based reimbursement claim. I have documentation of the hiding. I see that. Timothy was in folder 3 now, scrolling through the screenshots with the deliberate pace of someone who was building a case in real time in their head. Social media check-ins at locations inconsistent with where she said she was. Merchandise that doesn't match disclosed spending. Envelope photographs from unrecognized issuers. He looked up again. You said you overheard her mention she'd added a card. Did she indicate how? She said she got approved. Didn't say how. Did she indicate the account was in her name only? She didn't indicate anything about the structure, just the balance. Timothy nodded slowly. Discovery will get us the full picture, but I want you to know, if she listed you as an authorized user on any account you didn't consent to, that's not just marital fraud, that's financial fraud with potential criminal implications. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. I don't want her arrested. Kenneth said it before the silence could be filled with anything else. Whatever she's done, I'm not trying to destroy her. I want out of this marriage, and I want to recover what I can. That's it. Timothy looked at him for a moment. I understand. We keep the criminal angle in reserve. Leverage without deployment. He turned to a fresh page of his legal pad. Here's how this goes. First, I file the petition this week. Georgia allows grounds based on the marriage being irretrievably broken, which we can establish, but we'll also document the fraud for the reimbursement argument. Second, discovery. We pull her full credit history, employment records, everything. Third, reimbursement claim. $71,400 paid under conditions of active deception. We argue the payment was made in reliance on a representation she had no intention of honoring. Kenneth watched him write. Clean strokes, no hesitation. Wednesday is 4 days from now. He paused. I mean this Wednesday. Today, I know. I'll file Thursday morning. She'll be served this weekend, most likely Saturday afternoon, depending on process server availability. Saturday. Kenneth did the math without meaning to. 48 hours from right now. 48 hours of being the husband she expected to see when she looked up from her phone. 48 hours of making coffee in the kitchen, where he'd stood frozen at 5 a.m. and heard everything he'd spent 7 months suspecting confirmed in her own voice, by her own laugh. He could do 48 hours. One more thing, Kenneth said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out because he'd been carrying it for 4 months, and this was the first room it was safe to put it down in. The way I handle the 4 days between now and when she gets served, practically speaking. What do I do if she notices something's off? Timothy considered this without any performance of considering it. You behave exactly as you have been behaving. Same schedule, same conversations, same level of engagement. This is not deception on your part. This is preservation of the evidentiary environment. A pause, and Mr. Osei, don't tell anyone, not friends, not family, not until after service. Kenneth thought about Brian in the back seat, the quiet way he'd said, "You're the most reliable person I know." Understood. He drove back to Northbridge with 11 minutes to spare before his afternoon shift. He sat in the parking lot for 8 of those minutes, not because he was paralyzed, not because he'd changed his mind, but because he understood, sitting there in the November cold with the engine running and his 3 folders in the bag on the passenger seat, that some decisions don't feel real until after you've made them. This one had just become real. He'd walked into a building and put his name on a process. Things were going to happen now in a sequence he couldn't reverse. He thought about the motorcycle he'd sold on that Sunday afternoon, the stranger's truck pulling away, the way he'd told himself things can be replaced when the important stuff is settled. He thought about Selena saying she didn't deserve him. The important stuff, it turned out, had not been settled. It had never been on its way to being settled. He got out of the car, went back to work. Dinner that night, Wednesday, Selena made pasta, which was notable, because Selena making dinner on a weeknight was unusual enough to register as an event, and an event on the same day. Kenneth had just hired a divorce attorney. Created a particular kind of cognitive dissonance that he had to manage carefully and quietly while eating penne with jarred sauce and trying to look like a man whose world had not recently reorganized itself. She'd lit candles. 2 of them, the tall white ones she kept in the cabinet above the microwave for occasions she deemed worthy. She'd poured wine. She was wearing the deep green wrap dress he'd told her once made her eyes look like they were made of something expensive. "What's the occasion?" Not quite a question. He said it neutrally. "No occasion." She smiled across the table, and it was a good smile. It really was. The kind she'd deployed on him across a different table 3 years ago in a Ponce City Market coffee shop when she'd looked at his design work and told him exactly what worked and what didn't. "I just wanted to do something nice." "You've been carrying a lot." "I'm fine. You've lost weight." "I've been busy, Kenneth." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. Her fingers were warm. Her nails were manicured in a pale pink he'd never seen before. He didn't ask where she'd gotten them done. "Maybe it's time to think about dropping one of the jobs. We're doing so much better now. I was looking at the spreadsheet last week." She'd looked at the spreadsheet. He looked at her hand on his. Thought about the 3 folders in the locked desk drawer 8 feet from where they were sitting. "I'll think about it," he said, which was the most honest thing he'd said all evening, because he was in fact going to think about it. He was going to think about it extensively, just not in the direction she meant. Thursday, Friday, 2 days that passed in the specific texture of waiting, which is different from patience. Patience is chosen. Waiting is what patience looks like from the outside, while something else entirely is happening on the inside. Kenneth moved through both days with the precision of someone who understood that the most dangerous thing he could do was hurry. He did not hurry. He loaded trucks. He organized manifests. He did the data entry shift during lunch. He drove rideshare Thursday evening. He did the freelance design work for a barbershop in East Point on Friday night. A logo refresh the owner needed by Monday. He sat at his desk after Selena went to sleep and worked until 1 a.m., and then put his work away and lay in the dark next to his wife and listened to her breathe and thought about the space between who someone is and who you thought they were. Saturday, Timothy texted at 9 a.m. "Process server will attempt delivery between 1 and 5 p.m. today. Recommend you be out of the apartment during that window." He went to work his security shift at Atlantic Station, walked the perimeter, answered 2 questions about parking validation, watched a Sata crowd move through the shops with the particular energy of people who had nowhere pressing to be, which struck him as a form of wealth he hadn't thought about in years. At 2:43 his phone started. 8 calls, 12 texts. He read them in the parking garage during his 15-minute break, standing between a Camry and a pickup truck, with the concrete ceiling 2 feet above his head and the particular smell of parking structures everywhere. The first text said someone was at the door with papers, and was this a prank? The 4th text said she'd signed for it because the man said she had to, and what was this? The 8th text was just punctuation, 5 exclamation points followed by a question mark, which he found in a completely humorless way, almost impressive in its economy. He put the phone back in his pocket, finished his shift. At 11:52 p.m. he came home. She was on the couch. The divorce petition on the coffee table, pages slightly wrinkled, like she'd read them more than once. The candle from Wednesday was on the side table, unlit. She was wearing the gray, oversized sweatshirt she wore when she wasn't performing anything for anyone, which in its own way was more disarming than anything she could have deliberately chosen. Kenneth. Her voice came out unsteady. Not the practiced unsteady she sometimes used when a conversation needed emotional ballast. The actual kind. We shouldn't talk without our attorneys present. I don't want to talk about attorneys. She stood up, moved toward him. He didn't move back. Didn't move toward her either. Just stood. 3 years. 3 years I've been here with you. You filed papers without saying a word to me. Without even giving me the chance to. I heard you, Selena. She stopped. Monday morning, 5 a.m. The bedroom door was open. He watched it happen. The shift in her face, the calculation, the sequence of emotions she tried to cycle through, landing on the one she thought would be most useful. That was a private conversation with my friend. $13,800. He said it the same way he'd said $119,000 to Timothy Clark 2 days ago. Just a number. Just a fact. On a card I didn't know existed. Plus what you've been sending to Maya's apartment. Plus the things I found under the tarp in the garage. He paused. You want to talk about the tarp, Selena? Because I'm curious what explanation you had ready for that. She didn't answer. I ate peanut butter and bread for lunch for 2 years to save money. I walked to work 3 mornings a week to save gas. I sold the shadow. He stopped, breathed. While you were buying $800 bags and having them sent to your sister's place so I wouldn't see them. Kenneth, I have a problem. You've always known I have a problem. You can't hold my addiction against me like. There's a difference. He heard his own voice go very quiet, which was a thing that happened sometimes when he needed to hold something still. Between struggling with something and building a system to hide it from the person working himself flat to help you. Those aren't the same thing. She looked at him for a long moment, then something shifted. The prepared version of her made space for something smaller and more complicated underneath. I know, almost a whisper. I know that. He picked up his bag. I've rented a room in Decatur. I'll come back for my things this weekend with Brian. He looked at her one more time. Not in anger. Not in cruelty. Timothy Clark is my attorney. His number is in the papers. He walked out for the second time in a week. The first time he hadn't known where he was going. This time he did. The room in Decatur was 400 square feet, with a bed that was clean, and a window that faced a parking lot and a bathroom door that stuck if you didn't lift the handle just right. It was the most peaceful place he'd been inside in 3 years. He sat on the edge of the bed in his work clothes in the dark and let that fact settle around him without trying to explain it. His phone had messages from Selena. He didn't open them. He had a text from Brian. Heard you came by the apartment and picked up some things. You good? He typed back. Yeah, explain later. It was 1:17 a.m. He set his alarm for 5:03, not accidentally. On purpose. Because Kenneth Osei was the kind of man who, even in the middle of the thing that was quietly breaking him open, would get up and go to work. And because he had 3 folders in his bag, and a consultation documented, and an attorney retained, and 4 days of behavior on record, and a lawyer who'd told him Wednesday that the paperwork always matters more than the conversation, which was a thing Kenneth had been believing his whole career, without ever having it apply this directly to his actual life. The alarm would go off at 5:03. He would be awake before it. He already was. Word count 4,127 wait. Self-scan initiated. Target 7,000. 508,500. Current insufficient. Continuing. He lay in the dark and thought about the specific geography of how he'd gotten here. Not emotionally, literally. The physical sequence of events that had deposited him in a 400-square-foot room in Decatur on a Saturday night in November, with a thermos on the nightstand and a locked drawer full of evidence about his own marriage. He'd met Selena Moore because of a logo. That still struck him as almost funny when he let himself think about it. Not funny as in amusing. Funny as in the particular irony of a thing that seems too small to have mattered. 3.5 years ago, he was doing freelance design on the side, which was not unusual for him. He'd been doing it since grad school, picking up projects in the evenings and on weekends, logos and brand identities, and the occasional social media asset for small businesses in the city. It supplemented the warehouse income without requiring him to be anywhere. He could do it at 10 p.m. in his apartment in his socks. It was the most sustainable kind of second job he'd ever found. Bright Curve Media had found him through a referral. Small marketing agency, East Atlanta, needed a rebrand on a deadline. The contact email came from someone named S. more, senior account lead, terse and specific, and structured the way briefs are structured by people who actually read creative briefs instead of just writing them and hoping for the best. He'd done good work on that project. He knew it at the time. The kind of work where you send the files over and then don't second-guess the choices because you made the right ones. Selena had written back the same day, not with approval, not with a list of changes, but with 3 precise sentences about what was working and 1 equally precise sentence about what wasn't, and then she'd said, "Can we meet to talk through the revision? I think better in person," he'd thought. This is a professional who knows how to run a project. He'd agreed to meet at Highland Bakery because it was equidistant from both their offices and had decent parking. She'd arrived before him. He walked in and found her already at a corner table with a real notebook open in front of her. Not a tablet, not her phone, an actual spiral notebook with handwriting in 2 different ink colors. She looked up when he walked in and her face did a small thing that he'd classified at the time as simply open. Just open, present, not performing interest, actually interested. They'd talked about the project for 40 minutes, then about design philosophy for 15, then about Atlanta, about the city's particular way of growing faster than it could process itself. He'd been at the coffee shop for an hour and 40 minutes when he'd looked at his watch and realized he'd meant to leave after 90. He'd asked for her number as a professional courtesy. He'd texted her that evening about something that had nothing to do with work. She'd texted back within 12 minutes. 6 months later, he'd been certain. He'd found someone who matched the quality of his own attention. Someone who brought the same directness to relationships that she brought to creative briefs. Who was engaged rather than performed. Who had the particular combination of self-possession and genuine interest that he'd spent most of his adult life looking for without being able to name. He'd proposed after a year. She'd said yes before he'd finished the sentence. 3 weeks after the wedding, she'd sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and told him about the debt. He lay in the dark room in Decatur and replayed that moment not for the first time, but with different eyes than he'd ever used before. He'd thought she was being brave. He'd thought the tears were the physical manifestation of relief, of finally being known by someone who wouldn't leave. He'd taken her hands and said, "We'll figure it out together," and meant it with his whole chest. Now he thought about something he'd read once in a management context, years ago. The principle of revealed preference. What people want isn't what they say they want. It's what they choose when the choice actually costs them something. Every choice she'd made over the past 3 years had revealed a preference that contradicted every word she'd said at that kitchen table, and he'd been too committed to his own version of events to read the data that was right there in front of him. He was reading it now. 3 folders, $71,400, Monday morning, 5:03 a.m., the laugh. The thing about building evidence in a professional context is that it doesn't require you to feel anything about the evidence. You observe, you document, you categorize. The conclusions follow from the data without you having to manufacture them. Kenneth had spent 14 years training himself to separate the observation from the judgment, to hold information carefully before acting on it. That discipline had served him well in inventory management. It had also, he understood now, allowed him to stay in a situation for 7 months longer than he would have if he'd been less methodical and more reactive. He didn't know if that was a failure or a competency. He thought about calling his parents in the morning. His father, Clarence Osei, who had worked 2 jobs for 11 years when Kenneth was young and never once made his family feel like a burden for requiring it. His mother, Margaret, who had gone back to nursing school at 42, while working nights and raising a kid, and had never described it as sacrifice, just as what needed to happen. He'd grown up in a house where effort was not a transaction, where you did the work because the work was what love looked like in practice. He'd carried that into this marriage, all of it, uncritically, without ever asking whether the person on the other side was operating from the same understanding of what the work was for. That, he thought, was the actual mistake. Not the love, not the staying, not even the working. The assumption that she shared his framework, that when he said "we'll figure it out together," she had heard that the same way he'd said it. She had not heard it that way. She had heard it the way someone hears a guarantee. He thought about what Timothy Clark had said. "We argue the payment was made in reliance on a representation she had no intention of honoring." Legal language, clean and useful. But underneath the legal language was something that didn't have clean and useful language. The feeling of being 38 years old and lying in a 400-square-foot room reconstructing the last 3 years through the lens of a conversation you were never supposed to hear. Sunday morning he woke at 5:03 without the alarm, made coffee in the small kitchenette with the 2-cup machine the landlord had left, stood at the window that faced the parking lot, watched a gray Atlanta Sunday start to organize itself. He texted Brian, "Can you come help me get my stuff from the apartment next weekend?" Brian replied in 4 minutes, which meant Brian was also awake at 5:03 on a Sunday for his own incomprehensible reasons. Obviously, you eating? He texted back, yes, which was not quite true yet, but it felt like the right direction. He had 4 days until he'd sit across from Timothy Clark again for the formal case review. He had however long the legal process took after that. He had an unknown number of conversations still ahead of him, with attorneys and mediators and eventually a judge, conversations in which the entirety of the last 3 years would be laid out in documentation, and examined by people who had no stake in any version of the story being true. That should have frightened him. Instead, it felt like the first solid ground he'd stood on in a while. He was a man who kept records. He was a man who had kept very good records. And in the coming weeks and months, those records were going to matter in ways that the person who made him necessary to create them had not anticipated. He rinsed the coffee cup, put it upside down on the drying rack, got dressed, went to work, because that's what you do. When you are Kenneth Osei, when you were built from the specific material of people who understood that your word is the only thing that actually belongs to you, you show up. Even when the thing you've been showing up for has turned out to be something other than what you signed on for. You show up until you don't, and then when you stop completely. He had stopped. Now he was starting something else. He just didn't know yet exactly what it was going to look like. He would. The room in Decatur had a radiator that clicked every 40 minutes like something checking in. Kenneth had learned the rhythm by day 3. By day 5 he was using it to mark time the way other people used clocks. Something solid and regular in a week that had very little solid in it. Monday came back around the way Mondays do when you've been through a Saturday that rearranged your life. Not gently, just there, insisting on itself. He got to Northbridge at 5:48, and George was already at the loading bay, with the particular posture of a man who had information he was deciding how to deliver. George let him get his badge scanned first. Then Jerome. Kenneth kept walking. "Jerome heard you on the phone in break room B last Wednesday. Break room B has a closed door. Jerome can hear through 3 inches of poured concrete. I've verified this personally." A pause. "He told Keisha in accounting." Kenneth stopped. Keisha told Denise in HR. Denise told Marcus at the dock. Marcus told the Tuesday crew. The Tuesday crew told everybody else. George's expression was the definition of unhelpful. Not because he was amused, because he had delivered the information completely and was now waiting for Kenneth to process it. Also, Keisha brought brownies, fudge, with walnuts, left them on your desk with a note. He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded square of paper. Note says, "And I am reading this accurately, thinking of you during this difficult time. My cousin Renee is a family law attorney. Number below." Kenneth took the note, read it, folded it back. "I already have an attorney. I know. I don't need Renee. I know. Did you eat the brownies?" The smallest pause, 3 of them. "I'm a supervisor. It's a perk." Kenneth looked at George White, who was standing there being completely useless in the most steadying possible way, and felt something shift in his chest that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite not. "Thank you," he said, "for the break room, for the 3 brownies, for standing here being a geological formation in human form at 6 in the morning." George nodded once. "Bay 4 has a discrepancy, manifests on your desk, and that was that." He worked. The morning shift was the kind of physical work that usually helped, the kind where your body is occupied enough that your mind has to settle for background noise instead of full volume. Except today, the background noise had content. Selena's attorney, whose name Timothy had forwarded to him Sunday evening, was a man named Eric King. Kenneth had looked him up the same way you look up information you already know is going to be bad and just want to get the badness confirmed. Eric King had a Buckhead office, a Rolex he wore in his professional headshot, and a particular specialty in high-conflict divorce proceedings, which told Kenneth everything he needed to know about the instructions Selena had walked in there with. She wasn't trying to settle, she was trying to win. Which, fine. He went back to counting boxes. The counter petition came Tuesday. Timothy called him during the afternoon break. And the way Timothy opened with "sit down, if you can," told Kenneth, before a single word of substance that the news required, seat. He sat on a crate in Bay 2. Selena's attorney filed a counter petition this morning. She's seeking spousal support. The loading dock hummed around him. On what basis? She's arguing she declined a significant career opportunity in order to support the marriage and accommodate your work schedule, and that she's now in a financially disadvantaged position as a direct result of the marriage. What opportunity? Allegedly a senior position in Charlotte, offered approximately 3 years ago. Her position is that she turned it down because you didn't want to relocate. Kenneth sat with that for exactly as long as he needed to, which was about 4 seconds. She wasn't offered anything in Charlotte. Tell me what you know. She worked at Bright Curve Media when we met. That's how I met her. I did design work for them. She was there when we got married. Then about 8 months into the marriage she told me she was let go. She said it was a restructuring thing, budget cuts. She said she was let go. That's what she said. He heard Timothy writing, and you haven't seen any correspondence, any offer letters, anything that would suggest a position was offered and declined. Never. Nothing like that ever came up. She didn't want to move to Charlotte. We never had that conversation because the premise never existed. Good. I'll request her full employment records from Bright Curve in Discovery. Georgia allows it. Another beat of writing. There's more. She's also claiming you discouraged her professional development throughout the marriage by maintaining a work schedule that required her to shoulder domestic responsibilities alone. Kenneth thought about the apartment. The apartment where Selena had a cleaning service come twice a month, paid for on the joint account. The apartment where she had never once in 3 years cooked dinner on a weekday, unless there was a reason she needed him to feel warmly toward her. The apartment where his little workspace in the corner was the only surface he kept tidy because it was the only surface he regularly used. Domestic responsibilities. All right, he said, because what else do you say to that? What available word captures the specific texture of hearing your 3 years reframed into something unrecognizable by someone who lived inside those same 3 years? There's one more thing. Timothy's voice changed slightly, not dramatically. Just the tone adjustment of a man who is about to say something that requires the other person to be paying attention. She called your workplace Monday morning. His jaw tightened. I know. George handled it. She told them it was a family emergency. It wasn't a family emergency. No. But Mr. Osei, I need you to understand what this pattern indicates. She is testing boundaries because she doesn't believe yet that this is real. She's looking for a way to get around the legal channel to reach you directly. Document every instance. George's witnessing of the call is useful. Write it down tonight. Date, time, what George observed, his full name. Already did. A pause, the kind Timothy used when he was recalibrating his estimate of a client. You're going to be fine, he said. And he didn't say it the way people say things to make other people feel better. He said it the way accountants say the numbers work out. Wednesday. Kenneth drove his rideshare shift the way he always did, because he'd said he would, and because $43 was $43, and because the rhythm of other people's destinations was something he found, right now, oddly grounding. Someone needed to get from Midtown to the airport. Someone needed to get from Cabottown to Little 5 Points. Small, clean problems with clear solutions. His 9th fare of the night was a woman named Sharon Lewis. He knew her name from the app. She came out of a house in Cascade Heights carrying a quilted tote bag and moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had decided a long time ago exactly how fast she intended to go through the world and had found that pace to be correct. 65. Maybe 67. Tok Chung New Bong. King Gong to Kiel Ku. Chom New Da Chen Kun Mat Ba to Hikon Chair. She settled into the back seat with the arrangement of someone who was comfortable in lift cars and had opinions about the ones that didn't have the temperature right. He had the temperature right. She looked at him in the rearview mirror for a moment before they'd even pulled out of the driveway. You're tired. Not a question. A reading. Long week. She looked out the window. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. He didn't respond. He pulled out onto Cascade Road, Atlanta spreading itself out in the particular way it does at 10:30 on a Wednesday. Not quite done for the night, but winding down. My late husband drove rideshare for a while, Sharon said. After he retired, He said he liked it because it was clean. You had a task, you did the task, you got paid, nothing to interpret. That's about right. He also said the hardest passengers were the ones who needed to talk and didn't know it yet. A pause. I'm going to guess you're one of those. He flicked his eyes up to the mirror. She was looking right back with the perfect composure of someone who had long since stopped finding human behavior surprising. My wife and I are separating, he said, which was not something he'd planned to say. Except it came out the way things come out when you've been holding them in a closed hand for a while and someone opens a door. How long were you married? 3 years. How long were you working yourself past what was reasonable for the sake of the marriage? He thought about that. 3 years. Sharon Lewis made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite sympathy, but somewhere in the useful space between them. My late husband had a saying. He said the worst thing you can do for someone who doesn't want to be responsible is to be responsible enough for both of you. Because then they never have to be. Kenneth drove. The highway lights streaked past. What did he do? Kenneth said when he realized he was doing that. He stopped. Simple as that. Not dramatically. Not with a speech. He just stopped, and the person either grew into the space that opened up, or they showed you exactly who they'd been the whole time. He pulled off at Ormwood Park. Her street was quiet. Trees on both sides, leaves halfway gone, the gray November pavement. She gathered her bag before the car was fully stopped, which was the habit of someone who had been moving through the world on her own schedule for decades. She got out. Then she turned back and looked at him through the open door. The man who drives himself past his own limits for someone who isn't paying attention to what it costs him. She said it with something in her voice that was neither pity nor admiration, but something more useful than both. That man deserves to find out what he can do when he's driving for himself. She closed the door. He sat for a moment at the curb after she walked away. Then he pulled out and drove home. To the 400-square-foot room. To the clicking radiator. To the 3 folders in his bag that had been sitting there long enough that they'd started to feel like a permanent feature of his body weight. Thursday. Timothy called at 6:45 in the evening, which was outside his normal contact hours, which meant the news warranted it. Discovery results are in. Partial but significant. Kenneth was eating rice and chicken at the small table in his room. He put down the fork. Tell me. Selena doesn't have 1 unknown credit card. She has 3. He did not respond right away. He just sat with the number. 3. Not one that she'd mentioned in that phone call on Monday morning. Not even the one she'd admitted to in the way you admit to things when you're sure no one's listening. 3. Total balance across the 3 accounts? $29,400. He pushed the plate to the side. One of the accounts. Timothy's voice adjusted again. That particular gear shift lists you as an authorized user. I didn't authorize that. I know you didn't. She opened it using your home address, placed you as an authorized user without your knowledge or consent. If she defaults, creditors can come to you. This is not an oversight, Mr. Osei. This is deliberate financial fraud, a beat. We have the option to report this. Georgia Criminal Code covers it. I told you before, I don't want her arrested. And I told you we keep it in reserve. The difference is that now we have the documentation to make that threat real, if we need to. Eric King is going to want to settle quickly when he understands what we're holding. Attorneys like King read the room. He'll see the exposure. Kenneth stood up, walked to the window. The parking lot below was what it always was, which was a parking lot, which somehow still had more truth in it than any room he'd shared with Selena in 3 years. The employment records, he said. Also back. Bright Curve Media provided everything we requested. Another beat, slightly longer this time. There was no Charlotte offer. He'd known, he'd said it to Timothy on Tuesday. But knowing and hearing the confirmation documented are 2 different weights. She was separated from Bright Curve not due to restructuring. Timothy continued. She was terminated for cause. Expense report fraud. She inflated client entertainment costs and personal expenses over a period of 8 months. The company documented it, warned her twice, and then let her go. He stood at the window and absorbed that. Expense report fraud at her previous job. Undisclosed debt accumulated over years of fabricated financial stability. 3 secret credit cards. One of them with his name on it without his permission. A counter-petition built on a job opportunity that never existed. The same pattern, different surfaces, over and over for years with different people. He was not the first system she'd exploited. He was just the most recent and the most thorough. When's the mediation? He asked. January 6th. I've requested a conference room at my office. Neutral mediator, a woman named Deborah White, 20 years in family law mediation. She doesn't have favorites. And the hearing, if we don't settle. March at the earliest. Family court in Fulton County has a backlog. He did the math. 2 months of this particular suspension. 2 months of living in a room that clicked every 40 minutes while the legal process moved at its own geological pace. All right, he said. All right, Timothy agreed. He ate the rest of his dinner cold. The week that followed had a shape to it that wasn't dramatic. Dramatic would have been easier. Drama at least has movement. What he had instead was the particular stillness of a man who had made a decision and was now required to wait for the decision to produce its results, which is a kind of patience that has nothing peaceful about it. Friday night she called from a number he didn't recognize. He almost picked up. Then the area code came up as the same as Olivia's number, which he knew because he'd seen it on Selena's phone enough times, which meant she'd borrowed Olivia's phone, which meant she'd noticed he'd blocked her and had gone one layer further to get around it. He let it ring. Then he texted Timothy's number and reported the attempt. Date, time, number used, his basis for identifying it, because that's what you do with a pattern. You don't react to each instance, you document the pattern. Saturday morning. His day off from everything, which he was still not entirely sure what to do with, because he'd had effectively no full days off in 3 years, and the absence of scheduled obligation felt strange in the way that silence feels strange after you've been somewhere very loud for a long time. He drove to his parents' house in West End. Clarence Osei answered the door. In the cardigan he wore every Saturday morning without exception, grey wool, missing the second button from the bottom. A garment that had achieved the status of a personality rather than just clothing. He looked at his son standing on the porch. You look different, Clarence said. I feel different. Come in. Your mother's making eggs. He sat at his parents' kitchen table, which was different from his kitchen table in every way that mattered, which was that this one had 40 years of actual use in its surface and not a single meal on it that anyone had eaten alone. Margaret Osei came out of the back bedroom, still in her nurse's scrubs from the night shift she'd apparently just gotten home from, and she looked at her son once, and then came over, and put her hand on the back of his head, the way she'd done when he was 7, and needed to understand that the problem was not as large as it felt. She didn't ask anything. She went back to the eggs. Clarence sat across from him and poured coffee. You're going to tell us, he said. Not a question, but not a demand either. Just an open door, Kenneth told them. The same way he'd told Timothy, but without the legal framework stripped away. The debt, the 3 years, the phone call, the folders, the 3 cards he hadn't known about, the Charlotte story that wasn't true, the counter-petition asking him for support. After everything, his father listened the way Clarence Osei listened to everything, with the full weight of his attention, without the fidgeting that lesser listeners used to signal they were still engaged. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make sounds of sympathy that were really about his own discomfort. He just listened. When Kenneth finished, his father was quiet for a moment. The motorcycle, Clarence said. Yeah, you sold the motorcycle to make a payment. 18 months ago. Clarence looked down at his coffee. Then you didn't tell us. No, why not? Kenneth thought about that, because I didn't want you to think less of her. Clarence nodded slowly, the nod of a man who recognized a quality in his son that was both the best and the most dangerous thing about him. You protected her from us, Margaret said from the stove, while she was not protecting you from herself. She said it without turning around, with the flat clarity of a woman who had spent 30 years in nursing and understood that diagnosis did not require gentleness to be accurate. Kenneth looked at the eggs she was making. Yeah, he said, that's right. Clarence reached across the table, didn't say anything, just put his hand on Kenneth's forearm for a moment, then moved it back. That was the whole conversation. And also it was everything. He drove back to Decatur that afternoon with something slightly different in his chest. Not better exactly, more like calibrated. The way an instrument sounds when it's been tuned by someone who knows the difference between close and correct. He had a mediation in 6 weeks, and a hearing in 4 months, and $29,400 documented in discovery, and an employment record from Bright Curve Media that was going to land on Eric King's desk and be a problem for everyone on that side of the table. He thought about something Clarence had once told him, years ago, about a dispute with a contractor that had cost his father time and money, and eventually went to small claims court. The contractor had been very confident through the whole process, right up until the judge asked for the receipts, and it turned out Clarence had every single one. People who operate in good faith keep the receipts, his father had said, because they have nothing to hide. And when someone who kept all the receipts walks into a room against someone who didn't, the room has a way of knowing which one is which. He pulled into his parking spot and sat in the car for a moment. He had all the receipts. He had the receipts in 3 colors with timestamps and confirmation numbers and photographs and subpoenaed text messages. And a statement from a former employer, and the recorded notes of a phone call he'd overheard at 5:03 on a Monday morning that had started this whole sequence of events. The question was not whether he could prove what had happened. The question was whether a judge in Fulton County was going to look at what had happened and decide that the law had something useful to say about it. He was about to find out. Mediation morning, January 6th, he woke at 4:48, which was earlier than the alarm, which was the thing that happened when his body understood something consequential was coming and decided to skip the pretense of sleeping through it. The room was dark. The radiator clicked once. He lay there and watched the ceiling and made a list in his head of the things he knew to be true, which was a habit he'd developed as a teenager when his father taught him that the way through anxiety was not to deny it, but to account for it, to separate what you knew from what you feared and deal with each category on its own terms. What he knew. He had documentation of $71,400 paid toward Selena's pre-marital debt. He had discovery evidence of $29,400 in new debt she'd accumulated while he was paying down the old. He had employment records showing she was terminated for expense fraud at her previous job, which directly contradicted the Charlotte story her attorney was going to lead with. He had subpoenaed text messages to her sister that documented deliberate concealment. He had Timothy Clark, who had been doing this for 28 years, and had told him on the phone Monday that the evidentiary picture was the strongest he'd seen in a case of this type. What he feared, that it wouldn't be enough, that legal systems were not designed to account for the specific texture of being worked like a resource by someone who knew exactly which levers to pull. That Selena, who had spent 3 years performing one version of herself for him, would simply perform a different version for a mediator and a judge and produce enough reasonable doubt about her own intentions to muddy the water. He got up, made coffee, got dressed. The suit was the one he'd worn to his wedding because it was the one good suit he owned, and he was not going to spend money on a new suit when this one still fit, even if it fit slightly looser now than it had on the day he'd stood at an altar and said words he'd believed completely. He took the subway to Buckhead. Timothy had suggested parking would be expensive, and the red line was direct. He sat on the train with his bag on his lap, and 3 folders inside it, and watched Atlanta pass underground and then above ground as the train elevated near Arts Center, the city coming into view in the early January gray. Northbridge would be starting the morning shift without him right now. George would be doing the walkthrough. Jerome would be in the wrong bay. Keisha would probably have made more brownies on the grounds that ongoing emotional support required ongoing baked goods, which he had come to understand as a specific and sincere form of care. He thought about all of them, about what it meant to have a floor under you made of people who just were there, who did not need you to explain yourself or manage their feelings about your situation, who showed up the same on Tuesday as on Saturday and let you do the same. He had not known how much that mattered until this year showed him precisely what it felt like when it wasn't true. The train stopped at Buckhead Station. He walked the 2 blocks to the building. The building where Timothy had his office was doing its usual impression of a place where decisions landed. Quiet lobby, real carpet, the specific kind of hushed that expensive buildings had instead of silence. Timothy was waiting for him outside the conference room. Ready, remember. I speak first on substance. You speak when addressed directly. When Eric King is talking, look at him or look at Deborah White. Don't look at Selena. Looking at Selena gives her information about your emotional state that she will use. Understood? If she says something that isn't true, you write it down. You don't react. You write it down and you hand it to me. Understood? Timothy looked at him for a moment longer than the briefing required. You've handled this better than most people would. I want you to know that. Not the reassurance variety, the factual variety. Walk in. They walked in. Deborah White was already at the table. She was the kind of woman who organized a room simply by being present in it, not through force, but through the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have made their peace with human messiness and now simply hold space for it. Tok back, deo king ban wiet, mod kwan sorte mo chuk mat, mod kok nuak a fia bain fi. She looked up when they entered and gave Kenneth the same brief, thorough look that Timothy had given him at their first meeting, the kind that was sizing him up without judgment. Mr. Osei, good morning. He sat down. 2 minutes passed. Then the door opened. Eric King came in first. Expensive suit, silver, the kind that photographed well. The Rolex was there on his wrist, exactly as advertised. He had the particular physical presence of a man who had won enough rooms to expect to win this one. Behind him, Selina. This was the first time Kenneth had seen her since the night he'd walked out of their apartment. 38 days. She had styled herself with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about what a wronged wife looked like. Conservative black dress, low heels, tok bui tep, gun new come sun. Understated jewelry, just the small pearl studs she'd owned before they met. The overall effect said, I am a woman who has been through something, and I am choosing dignity over drama. He looked at her for exactly as long as it took to confirm she was there. Then he looked at Deborah White, because Timothy was right. Every look he gave Selina was data, and he was done giving her free data. Deborah opened the session with the customary overview. This was a mediated settlement conference. The goal was to reach a mutually agreeable resolution without proceeding to a full hearing. Everything said in this room was confidential. Both parties were required to engage in good faith. Eric King leaned forward the moment she finished. He was smooth, genuinely smooth, the kind of smooth that came from saying plausible things in a confident register for a very long time. His client, he said, had come into this marriage with a financial challenge she had disclosed and actively worked to address. His client had supported her husband through an extraordinarily demanding work schedule, absorbing the domestic weight of the household so he could maintain 5 income streams. His client had declined a significant professional opportunity 3 years ago in service of the marriage. His client was now asking only for the support she was owed as a result of those sacrifices. Deborah White listened without expression. Then she looked at Timothy. Timothy opened the first folder. He laid the employment records from Bright Curve Media on the table with the unhurried precision of someone setting down something that doesn't need a speech. He said, Mrs. Osei did not decline an offer in Charlotte. She was separated from Bright Curve Media 9 months before the couple met. The separation was for cause. These are the employment records confirming the termination date, the stated reason, and the prior warnings issued. Eric King looked at the documents. Kenneth looked at Deborah White. Eric King said, those records were obtained without my client's consent. Timothy said they were obtained through standard discovery. Georgia allows it. We requested them. They provided them. Deborah White looked at Selina. Mrs. Osei, the documentation in front of me contradicts the timeline your attorney presented. You were let go from Bright Curve Media 9 months before you met your husband. Can you clarify how a Charlotte opportunity was declined in service of the marriage? Selina looked at Eric. Eric looked at the table. Then he looked at Deborah. There may be some confusion about the specific timing. My client did receive an expression of interest from a contact in the Charlotte market, though it may not have advanced to a formal offer. The underlying point remains that she made professional choices in service of the marriage. Deborah made a note. An expression of interest and a declined offer are materially different, Mr. King. Then Timothy laid down the second folder, credit card statements, 3 accounts, names, balances, dates. Account 3, with Kenneth's name as an unauthorized authorized user. He said it quietly and without drama because documents that say what these documents said did not require drama. They required only the absence of anything to contradict them. Eric King said, my client has a documented shopping disorder. The behavior described is symptomatic of that disorder and does not represent willful deception. Timothy said, there is a difference between a disorder and a system. Mrs. Osei was not making impulsive purchases she regretted later. She arranged for packages to be delivered to a third-party address. She added her husband's name to an account without his knowledge or consent to create financial liability for him. She told her friend in a recorded personal statement that she was aware her husband did not know about the spending and that she intended to continue concealing it. He pulled out the transcript of the overheard phone call. laid it flat. Mr. Osei is prepared to testify to this conversation in full under oath at the March hearing. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Not the quiet of people listening. The quiet of a particular card having been played. Deborah White read the transcript. She looked up. She looked at Selina. And in the specific quality of that look, which was not accusatory and not sympathetic and not anything except clear, Kenneth felt for the first time the full shape of where this was going. Selina felt it too. He could tell not because he was watching her, because he wasn't, because he was looking at Deborah White exactly as instructed, but because the energy in the room shifted in the way it shifts when someone who has been managing a performance loses the thread of it. Not dramatically, just slightly. The way a note goes flat before anyone can name what changed. Eric King conferred with Selina in a low voice. Kenneth could not hear the words. He heard the pace of it. Quick. Clipped the tone of an attorney recalibrating in real time. Then Eric looked up. My client would be open to discussing a modified arrangement, perhaps a smaller support figure for a limited duration with the understanding that Mr. King. Deborah White's voice did not change volume. It just stopped him. Let me be transparent with you. The documentation presented today significantly undermines the basis of your client's counter-petition. The Charlotte claim is not supportable as presented. The debt accumulation pattern, including the unauthorized use of her husband's name on a credit account, creates exposure that goes beyond this proceeding. I would encourage you and your client to seriously consider your position before we proceed to the full hearing. Eric King took a breath. That breath did a lot of communicating. He put his pen down, turned to Selina. They spoke again more briefly this time, and in the space of that conversation, something became visible on Selina's face that had not been visible since the hearing began. Not the prepared version, not the wronged wife in the understated jewelry. Something rawer. She had not expected this room to look like this. She had expected a fight she could manage the way she had managed other things. A space where her version of events had equal weight to his, because he was not the kind of person who kept receipts. Except he was. Except he had. Except the 3 folders were right there on the table. And then Selina Moore Osei, who had spent 3 years building a system, and 6 weeks building a legal argument, did something that Eric King's face told Kenneth very clearly he had not been consulted on. She spoke directly. Not to Timothy. Not to Deborah White. To Kenneth. You know what the real problem is? Her voice had changed. Not the careful version. Not even the kitchen table version from the night he'd moved out. This was the version underneath all of those. You made it too easy. You were so committed to being the good one. The reliable one. The man who doesn't leave. That I never had to try. You think that's a compliment? It wasn't. You were so busy being enough for both of us that you never made me be enough for myself. The room absorbed that. Eric King set down his pen. Deborah White stopped writing. Kenneth looked at Selina for the first time since she'd walked in. She looked back. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were too bright, and her hands were flat on the table, and she looked exactly like what she was. Someone who had just said the truest thing she had said in 3 years, and had said it into the wrong room at the wrong moment, and some part of her knew it. He didn't respond. He looked at Deborah White. Timothy leaned slightly forward. Co-White, I'd like the record to note what was just said. Deborah White's pen started moving again. Steady, thorough. It's noted, she said. Eric King looked at his client with the expression of a man who had won a lot of rooms and was currently watching one burn in real time and calculating what the fire insurance looked like. The mediation session ended 17 minutes later without a settlement, which was, Timothy explained to Kenneth in the hallway, after both Selina and Eric had left, the best possible outcome. She just testified against herself, he said. Not under oath, but Deborah White will document what she heard, and she'll be available for the March hearing if we need her. What Selina said in there, about making it easy, about never having to try, that's an admission that she understood the dynamic she was operating in and chose to continue exploiting it. Kenneth leaned against the hallway wall. I know. She thought she was defending herself. She was actually describing the fraud. I know. March, Timothy said. We go in March, and we go in stronger than we came in today. He took the red line back to Northbridge for the afternoon shift, sat on the train with his bag in his lap and 3 folders still inside it, and watched Atlanta pass in the reverse direction. The city looked the same as it had this morning, which was a thing about cities that he found right now both annoying and oddly comforting. They just kept going. The buildings didn't register your mediation. The traffic didn't pause for your revelations. The whole apparatus of the city continued its business with complete indifference to the fact that, 6 blocks from the Buckhead station, his estranged wife had just accidentally told a professional witness exactly what she'd been doing for 3 years. He clocked back in at Northbridge at 2:47. George looked at him. Kenneth said, Bay 4 still needs that manifest. George said Jerome moved the pallet wrap again. Kenneth said, of course he did, and he went back to work, because that's what you do. When you are built from the kind of material that shows up, you show up for the mediation, and then you show up for the afternoon shift, and you let the two things exist without drama, one after the other, each one asking of you exactly what it asks, and you give it. He had 1 month and 18 days until the March hearing. He had all the receipts. He was going to sleep tonight in a room that clicked every 40 minutes, and he was, for the first time in a long time, exactly as ready as he needed to be. January became February the way a long shift becomes the end of a long shift, slowly, then all at once. Kenneth had developed a new relationship with time during those weeks between the mediation and the March hearing. Not a comfortable relationship. More like the relationship you develop with a difficult coworker you have to share a space with indefinitely. You learn their habits. You stop fighting them. You find a way to be productive in the same room. He dropped the mall security job 2 weeks after the mediation. 12 hours every Sunday, gone. He'd expected to feel something dramatic about it, relief or guilt or some clean emotion he could identify by name. Instead, it just felt like putting down a box he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten he was carrying it. His back hurt less. He slept 20 minutes longer. That was it. That was the whole difference, which turned out to be enormous. The freelance design work he kept, because he'd always kept it, even before the debt, even before the marriage, back when it was just a thing he did because design was the part of his brain that worked in a different register than the inventory floor, a place where problems had aesthetic solutions instead of logistical ones. He did a logo for a natural hair care brand in West End, a 2-color thing in ochre and cream that the owner posted on Instagram and got 400 shares in a day. He took the check and deposited it, and felt something that was close to straightforward satisfaction. No asterisk, no mental calculation about where it was going next. The hearing was 43 days away when Selena showed up at Northbridge again. Not inside. She didn't try to get through the front. She parked across the road, in the lot that belonged to the lumberyard, which was technically public, in a silver Corolla he didn't recognize, which meant she'd borrowed it, which meant she'd thought about the fact that he knew her car. George spotted her first. He came and found Kenneth in Bay 4, with a particular pace that meant he was moving fast enough to convey urgency without actually running. Because George White did not run, as a principle. There's a woman in the lumberyard lot who's been sitting in a silver Corolla for 40 minutes. Kenneth looked up from the manifest. What's she doing? Watching the employee entrance. You recognize her. I recognize her from the photo your building's parking camera got the night she sat outside your apartment. He produced his phone. Showed the image. I may have asked your building manager to send to me after the first incident, for reference purposes. Kenneth looked at the image, then at George. You asked my building manager for surveillance footage. I asked him to share information relevant to the safety of an employee. Not a flicker of expression. Different thing. This was the part of George White that people who only knew him as the man who ate other people's brownies tended to underestimate. He was thorough. He was systematic. He was in the specific way that mattered most on Kenneth's side. I'll handle it, Kenneth said. You'll document it first. Yes, good. He took 2 photographs of the silver Corolla from the window of Bay 4. Timestamp visible in the corner. Vehicle description. Location relative to Northbridge property line. He texted both images to Timothy with a note, 3rd attempt to make contact at workplace. Lumberyard lot across from employee entrance. Vehicle not registered to subject. Will report to HR. Timothy responded in 4 minutes. Good, keep it, do not engage. He went back to the manifest. She left an hour later. That evening, on the data entry shift, he still ran from his room Tuesday and Thursday nights. He thought about what it cost to maintain that level of surveillance on another person, the logistics of it, borrowing a car, sitting for an hour in a lumberyard lot, the calculation that this was worth doing, the belief, still intact apparently, that if she could just get in front of him, something would change. He didn't understand it, and then he did. He was the thing she'd organized her last 3 years around. Not as a person, as a resource, as a structure, as a stability she'd outsourced rather than built. When you take away a structure that someone has been leaning on, without knowing they were leaning on it, they don't immediately find their feet. They reach for it. He was not going to be there to be reached for. He opened the data entry spreadsheet, started his shift. February moved. He went to see Carol Lee on the second Thursday. Her office was in a converted Victorian on Ponce de Leon, second floor, the kind of room where the chair you sit in was clearly chosen to put you at ease without trying too hard, and where the bookshelf had both academic texts and a small ceramic frog that had no professional justification for existing but that he'd found himself looking at every session without knowing why. Carol Lee was the kind of therapist who made silence functional instead of awkward, who asked one precise question per session and then let you do the work of answering it, who wore colors like rust and terracotta and amber, always warm, never demanding, as though she'd thought about how light affects the ability to be honest, and had adjusted accordingly. Third session, February 9th. "What do you miss?" she asked. Not what do you miss about her, what do you miss? The distinction mattered. He thought about it, really thought about it, didn't give the first answer that came up, which would have been something constructed, rather than real. The feeling that the work had a direction, he said finally. When I was paying down the debt, there was a goal. Color-coded columns on a spreadsheet. I knew what I was working toward. Even if it turned out the goal was false, the feeling of moving toward something was real. A pause. I miss having something to move toward that isn't a legal proceeding. Carol wrote something. She did this when he said something she considered useful, which he'd started reading as a form of validation, even though he understood that was probably a projection. What would you be moving toward if the legal proceeding wasn't the current foreground? He thought about the guitar. He'd bought it 3 weeks earlier, a used Yamaha acoustic from a music shop on Edgewood Avenue, $212, a price point he'd agonized over for 48 hours before Brian Thompson called him on a Sunday and said, "Kenneth, if you need someone to tell you to spend $200 on something you want, I'm telling you, spend the $200. He'd bought the guitar. He did not yet know how to play it well. He could play 3 chords, G, C, D. He'd watched a YouTube tutorial twice, and his left hand disagreed strongly with the chord shapes, and his fingertips had the particular tenderness of skin that was learning something new by the most direct possible method. But he played it every night for 15 minutes before bed, in the small room that clicked every 40 minutes, badly, competently, then slightly less badly. The process of getting slightly less bad at something by doing it repeatedly was, he'd found, unexpectedly absorbing. I'd be working on getting better at something I'm currently bad at, he told Carol. She wrote something longer this time. That, she said, in her direct and unhurried way, is what recovery sounds like. The hearing was set for the 3rd Thursday in March. Fulton County Superior Court. Judge Sandra Anderson presiding. Timothy prepared him over 4 sessions in the 3 weeks prior. Not prepped him the way attorneys prepped witnesses in films, which was to say not with scripts and rehearsed answers. Prepared him the way a good manager prepared a team for an audit. Understand the materials. Know the sequence. Be accurate. Don't volunteer what isn't asked. Don't fill silences that don't need filling. What is the single most important thing for you to communicate to the judge? Timothy said in their last session the Monday before. Kenneth answered without pausing that the money was paid under specific conditions, that those conditions were stated, repeated, and never honored, and that the violation of those conditions was not accidental. Timothy looked at him over the reading glasses he wore for close work. Don't say it that formally in there. Say it the way you just said it to me, but in your own words. That is my own words. Then you're ready. Wednesday night before the hearing, Kenneth sat at the small table in his room and did not do data entry and did not design anything and did not play the guitar. He ate the meal he'd made, rice and roasted chicken thighs, because he'd started actually cooking in the past few weeks, an activity he'd avoided for years on the grounds of time, and understood now that the time had always been there, it had just been allocated elsewhere. He opened the black notebook he'd bought at CVS, Biaden Zaivang. He'd bought it the week he moved out, and had been writing in it irregularly. Not a journal in the therapeutic sense, but more like a running account of his own thinking, the way you might keep a log during a complicated project to track what you know and what you still need to figure out. He wrote, "Tomorrow is the hearing. I've been working toward this since November. I have the documentation. I have Timothy. I have the truth, which is the thing I've had from the beginning, and which it turns out is more durable than I gave it credit for." He stopped. Read what he'd written, then added, "I'm not going to get everything I paid. I know that. The law doesn't work like that, and even if it did, there are things it can't account for. The 3 years of 5 a.m. alarms, the weight loss, the motorcycle. Those don't have a column in any spreadsheet." He stopped again. Thought. "But the reason I kept records was never really about the money. It was because I needed there to be a version of events that was accurate. That said what actually happened. And tomorrow there's going to be a room full of people whose job is to listen to that version. That's what I'm going to court for." Set his alarm for 5:30, which was late for him, which was, in its own small way, a form of progress. Thursday morning. March. Atlanta was doing that early spring thing where it couldn't decide whether it was still winter, the air cold enough in the morning to require a jacket but the light already doing something different, something with more intention in it. He noticed this on the walk from the MARTA station to the courthouse on Pryor Street, the light on the glass buildings, the color of it, slightly warmer than February's version of the same scene. He was wearing the new suit. He'd bought it during the second week of February. Navy, not quite the same shade as the wedding suit, darker, more deliberate, not expensive. $180 at the Macy's on Peachtree, during a sale that Brian had specifically texted him about. Because Brian Thompson tracked department store sales events with the same energy he applied to quarterly earnings reports. The suit fit correctly. He'd had the sleeves taken in at a tailor on Memorial Drive for $20. It looked like a suit that belonged to the person wearing it. Timothy was outside the courtroom when Kenneth arrived. He looked at the suit once. "Good," was all he said, which from Timothy Clark was a complete sentence. They went in. Fulton County Superior Court, courtroom 14, wood paneling, high ceilings, the specific institutional gravity of a space where consequential things were decided at a pace that had no interest in your feelings about it. Rows of fixed chairs, a clerk at a small desk, the kind of American flag that stood in the corner of every official room he'd ever been in. Judge Sandra Anderson was already on the bench reviewing files when they entered. "Peter hitam dalam, kacamata bingkai tipis hitam, tokmui tubui gon cow. Matduk titge hom lang fi mod kermat now val viek chun and nguichak." She had the posture of someone who had sat in that chair long enough to be completely unremarkable in it, which was exactly the kind of judge you wanted. Not a performer, a decision-maker. Eric King and Selena came in 4 minutes after them. Kenneth did not turn around. He heard them settle. He heard Eric King's expensive shoes on the floor. He heard the soft compression of the chair next to Eric as Selena sat down. He fixed his attention on the judge's bench and left it there. The hearing was called to order. Judge Anderson confirmed the nature of the proceedings. Dissolution of marriage. Petition filed by Mr. Kenneth Osei. Counterpetition filed by Mrs. Selena Moore Osei seeking spousal support. Primary outstanding issue, Mr. Osei's claim for reimbursement of funds paid toward his wife's premarital debt. Concurrent issue, validity of Mrs. Osei's counterpetition. "Mr. Clark, you may proceed." Timothy stood. He did not use volume, he used structure. The way he always used structure, building the argument the way you build a sound structure. Foundation first, then the walls, then the roof, each piece making the next one stable. He walked through the timeline. The disclosure 3 weeks post-wedding of $119,000 in premarital debt. The agreement between the parties that Mr. Osei would contribute his income toward reduction of that debt. The consistent documented payments over 3 years, totaling $71,400. The explicit repeated assurances from Mrs. Osei that she was working toward financial responsibility. Then he laid the counter-narrative. The 3 undisclosed credit accounts. $29,400 accumulated during the marriage while the payments were being made. The text messages to Maya Moore instructing her to receive packages so Mr. Osei would not see them. The unauthorized placement of Mr. Osei's name on a credit account. The termination for expense fraud at Bright Curve Media, directly contradicting the counter-petition's claim of a declined Charlotte opportunity. And then the transcript. He read 4 lines from it. Just 4. He chose them with the precision he brought to everything. The room was quiet in the way courtrooms are quiet when something that cannot be taken back has just been put on the record. Judge Anderson made a note, Mr. King counter-petition. Eric King stood. He was still good. Kenneth would give him that. The man could work with diminished materials. He reframed the Charlotte situation as an informal expression of interest rather than a formal offer, which was accurate and technically unhelpful, but at least consistent. He returned to the shopping disorder, the genuine psychological diagnosis. The argument that what looked like deception was actually the behavior pattern of someone struggling with a recognized condition. Judge Anderson let him finish. Then, Mr. Osei, please approach. Kenneth stood. Walked to the witness stand. Sat was sworn in. Judge Anderson looked at him directly. In your own words, Mr. Osei, why are you seeking reimbursement? He took one breath. Because I paid $71,400 over 3 years based on a specific understanding. My wife told me she was working to address her debt. She asked me to help. I said I would, and I did. What I didn't know was that she was simultaneously opening new accounts, adding to the total she'd asked me to help reduce, and deliberately hiding that from me. I found merchandise in my garage under a tarp. I heard her tell a friend that I didn't know what was happening. He paused. I'm not asking the court to punish her. I'm asking the court to recognize that those payments were made on a basis that was not true, and that the person I made them in support of understood that it was not true. Judge Anderson looked at him for a moment longer than the response required. Then she made another note. Anything further, Mr. Clark? Timothy stood. Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to call Deborah White. Deborah White came in from the hallway where she'd been waiting. She was sworn in. She confirmed her role as mediator at the January 6th conference. She confirmed what she had observed. Then Timothy asked her, in the course of that mediation, did Mrs. Osei make any statement regarding the nature of the marital dynamic? Deborah White looked at her notes. Mrs. Osei said, and I'm reading from my contemporaneous notes, you were so committed to being the good one, the reliable one, the man who doesn't leave, that I never had to try. Eric King said, Your Honor, statements made during mediation are typically confidential. Timothy said, Mrs. Osei volunteered that statement unprompted, directed at her husband, after the mediation had effectively concluded, and in the presence of both parties and the mediator. It was not a negotiating position. It was a characterization of the marital dynamic that is directly relevant to the fraud claim. Judge Anderson considered this for 4 seconds. I'll allow it. She was the whole court, and she just said she'd allow it. Kenneth looked at the wall behind the judge's bench. The wall was beige, institutional, completely unremarkable. He thought about the garage, about the tarp, about crouching down in the cold and opening those bags and taking photographs of every receipt with his phone, and then putting everything back exactly as he'd found it, covering it up again, going back inside, going to bed next to the woman who had put them there, because he was not ready yet, and the preparation was not complete. He thought about the clicking radiator. He thought about Sharon Lewis in the back of his car on a Wednesday night in November, saying the worst thing you can do for someone who doesn't want to be responsible is to be responsible enough for both of you. He thought about his father's hand on his forearm. Brief, complete, everything. I've reviewed the evidentiary record in its entirety, Judge Anderson said, and the room went the particular quiet of a room about to receive a decision. The documentation is extensive and credible. The timeline establishes a clear pattern. Mr. Osei made payments toward premarital debt in reliance on his wife's repeated assurances of changed behavior. The evidence demonstrates that those assurances were not supported by her actual conduct during the same period. The text messages, the undisclosed accounts, the unauthorized use of Mr. Osei's name as an authorized user, and Mrs. Osei's own statement in mediation, all support the conclusion that the payments were made under conditions of active misrepresentation. She paused. Georgia equitable distribution law allows this court discretion to adjust financial arrangements where fraud is established. I am exercising that discretion. She looked down at the papers before her, then up. The marriage between Kenneth James Osei and Selena Marie Osei is hereby dissolved, effective immediately. The first thing, regarding the reimbursement claim, given the documented amount paid, the documented nature of the misrepresentation, and the additional debt accumulated during the marriage, I am awarding Mr. Osei reimbursement in the amount of $52,000. This represents 73% of the documented payments. which accounts for the shared financial nature of marriage while reflecting the deliberate fraud established by the record. $52,000. He heard, let it land. Mrs. Osei is responsible for all debt incurred during the marriage, including the $29,400 in undisclosed accounts. Mr. Osei bears no liability for any of Mrs. Osei's debt, marital or premarital. Second thing, Mrs. Osei's counterpetition for spousal support is denied. The evidence does not support the claimed sacrifices, and the Charlotte opportunity as described in the counterpetition is not substantiated by the employment record provided in discovery. Third thing, Mrs. Osei will make payment to Mr. Osei in the amount of $52,000, either as a lump sum within 90 days or in structured monthly installments of not less than $8,600. Failure to comply will result in wage garnishment. The gavel. Not dramatic, just a sound, just the thing that ended proceedings. Kenneth sat in the witness chair for one moment longer than he needed to. $52,000, not the full amount, which he'd been prepared for, which Timothy had told him not to expect. But the direction was right and the number was real, and the judge had said fraud in an official courtroom in Fulton County, Georgia, and it was now part of a permanent record. He stood up, walked back to the table. Timothy shook his hand once. Firm, the handshake of a man who had done his job and knew it. The gallery was clearing. Eric King was already on his phone, moving toward the door with the efficiency of someone calculating next steps rather than processing what just happened. Selena was still at the table when Kenneth gathered his bag. He didn't look in her direction. He turned toward the aisle and then she said his name. Just his name. Nothing attached to it. He stopped, turned around. She was standing, not in the wronged wife posture, not in the prepared version. Just standing, with her bag in both hands in front of her, like something she didn't know what to do with, and her face doing the thing it had done once before, in the mediation, when the prepared version had run out, and what was underneath came forward. I don't expect you to believe this. Her voice was low. Not performing low, actually low, but I'm sorry. Not because we're standing here, because of what I did to get here. He looked at her. She looked back. I know what that's worth right now, she said, which is not much. He thought about what to say. Several things moved through him that he discarded before they became words. Not because they were untrue, because they were already true, and saying them wouldn't make them more so. What he said was, I hope you figure out what you actually want, not what you want to have, what you want to be. She didn't say anything to that. He walked out. The courthouse lobby was all marble and ambient noise, and people moving through on various missions of official consequence. He walked through it, and pushed through the glass door into the March air, which had decided, in the time he'd been inside, to become actually warm. Not humid yet, just warm. The particular Atlanta warm that was a promise rather than a fact. Timothy came out 2 minutes later. How are you feeling? I'm not sure yet. That's accurate. They walked toward the parking garage together, the city doing its usual thing around them, indifferent and continuous. The 52,000, Kenneth said. What happens now? She has 90 days to make the first payment or establish the installment schedule. If she misses, we go back to court and she faces garnishment. Eric King will advise her to pay. He'll know the exposure she has if she doesn't comply, given what's in the record. And if she doesn't, then we go back. But, Mr. Osei. Timothy stopped at the entrance to the garage, looked at him directly. You don't need to think about that today. Today you won something. Let today be what it is. He thought about that, decided Timothy was right. He said goodbye to Timothy in the garage, took the train back to the Decatur room, texted Brian, it's done. Brian responded in 90 seconds. Come over Saturday, we're celebrating. Then a second text, with food. Real food, I'm cooking. Then a third, don't tell me you have a shift, you don't have a shift. I checked with George. He looked at that last one for a moment. You checked with George. Another 90 seconds. Then he texted me Tuesday asking if you were free Saturday. He was very casual about it. I didn't ask questions. Kenneth put his phone down on the table and looked at the ceiling of the room that had been home since November. The radiator was quiet. It would click again in approximately 20 minutes. He knew the rhythm well enough now to predict it. He thought about the past 4 months in the way you think about something when it's done, and you can see the whole shape of it for the first time. November to March, the mediation in January, the counter petition, the 3 surveillance incidents at North Bridge, the employment records, the $29,400, the the transcript, the courtroom, the gavel, and the things alongside all of that. The guitar. 3 chords becoming 4, becoming 6. The Sunday mornings at his parents' table. Clarence's coffee, Margaret's eggs, Carol Lee and the ceramic frog and the question that had no wrong answer if you answered it honestly. George White and the brownies he ate without apology. Brian in the back of a lift, recalibrating his understanding of his best friend's life. The ground underneath him had been rebuilt, slowly, by people who just showed up and kept showing up. He'd been so busy noticing what had been taken that he'd almost missed what had been there all along. Almost. Saturday. Brian's apartment in Kirkwood. Brian Thompson cooked the way Brian Thompson did everything that wasn't accounting, which was to say with excessive confidence and no recipe and results that were somehow consistently better than they had any right to be. He'd made jerk chicken that had spent the night marinating and then been in the oven for 2 hours, rice and peas, fried plantains that were exactly the right color on the outside. They ate at Brian's actual table, which was unusual because Brian typically ate standing at his kitchen counter, like a man who considered sitting down for meals a luxury he hadn't budgeted for. The guitar, Brian said halfway through dinner. What about it? You said you've been playing. 3 months. Play something. I didn't bring it. Brian looked at him. I know, I'm asking you to go get it. It's Kirkwood. You're in Decatur. That's 12 minutes. He thought about this for exactly as long as it deserved. After we eat, he said. He went and got the guitar. He played in Brian's living room while Brian sat on the couch and did not say anything critical, which was the most useful thing he could have done. GCD. A new one he'd been working on for 2 weeks, E minor, which felt different from the others. More complicated, more interesting, a sound with more space in it. He was bad at it. Measurably, objectively bad. His transitions between chords were slow, his strumming was uneven. He paused to think too long between changes. He played for 12 minutes. When he stopped, Brian said, You're going to be good at that eventually. Not for a while. No, but you're going to be good at it. That was the whole review, and also it was the correct one. He got home late, parked in the Decatur lot, went upstairs. The room was the same room it had been for 4 months, except that he'd accumulated things in it now. The guitar in the corner, a coffee maker that was better than the landlord's, 3 books on the nightstand, a small print of a Georgia O'Keeffe flower that he'd bought at the thrift store on Flat Shoals because he liked the colors and could afford it, and didn't need a reason beyond that. He sat on the edge of the bed, pulled out the black notebook. Wrote, I got 52,000. I did not get 71,400. The difference is real and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter, because it does. But the judge said fraud in an official courtroom, and that's part of a permanent record now, which means there is a version of events that is true and documented and cannot be argued away. That matters too. Maybe more. He stopped. Read it back, added, Selena said she was sorry. I don't know what to do with that yet. Maybe nothing. Maybe it's not mine to do anything with. She has her own reckoning coming, or she doesn't, and either way I'm not the one administering it. He stopped again. Then, the hardest thing about all of this was not the work. I can work. I've always known how to work. The hardest thing was realizing that I'd been confusing effort with evidence. I thought that because I was giving everything I had, the thing I was giving it to must be real. That's not how it works. The effort was real. The sacrifice was real. The structure I was pouring it into was not. He put the pen down, closed the notebook, looked around the room, the guitar in the corner, the print on the wall, the coffee maker that was better than the one he'd left behind in the apartment on Candler Park Drive, which was not a hard standard to beat, but still, he'd chosen it. He'd bought it with his own money, based on his own preference for what a good cup of coffee required. Such a small thing. Such a completely uncomplicated small thing. He picked up the guitar, played E minor once, then the transition to G, which he'd gotten faster at. He could feel it. The muscle memory starting to build in his left hand, the calluses making the chord shapes less painful. Not good yet. Getting less bad. Which was, as Carol Lee had said, what recovery sounded like. 3 weeks later. Publix in East Point Saturday morning. He'd driven to East Point to pick up specific chicken thighs that the Decatur location never seemed to have, which was a thing he'd discovered about himself in the past few weeks, that he had opinions about chicken thighs, that not all chicken thighs were created equal, that the ones from this particular Publix were consistently better, and he had no scientific explanation for it, and he didn't need one. He was in the produce section when he heard his name. He turned around. Donna Jackson, Selena's mother. She was in the cardigan he associated with her, a soft terracotta one with deep pockets, carrying a handbasket, and she looked the way she had looked when he'd last seen her, which was at the family dinner, before everything came apart, except with something in her face, now that wasn't there before, a tiredness, not unhappiness, just the particular weight of someone who had been doing a hard thing. They looked at each other across the produce aisle for a moment. Then she moved toward him. Kenneth. She put her hand on his arm briefly. Her eyes were direct and warm and did not look away. How are you? I'm doing well. Better every month. Good. She nodded. Good. She held the handbasket in both hands in front of her, the same way Selena had held her bag in the courtroom, which was a thing he noticed without knowing what to do with it. I want you to know that we heard what happened. Not from Selena, she didn't tell us details. From the documents, from what Raymond was able to piece together. She paused. We owe you an apology that we can't really make up to you. We raised her. What she did to you came from somewhere in the way she was raised, and I have to live with that. You couldn't have known, he said. Because it was true. She's good at the surface. Donna looked at him. That's too generous of you, maybe, but it's accurate. She's seeing someone, Donna said. A therapist. She's going every week. I don't know if it'll hold. She's chosen to stop 100 times. A pause. But she's choosing to go right now, and I wanted you to know that part, for whatever it's worth to you. He thought about what it was worth to him. I'm glad, he said. And he meant it in the way that you mean a thing that has nothing to do with you anymore. Not warm, not cold, just neutral and clean. Donna looked at him for a long moment. You deserved better than what she gave you. I've thought about that a lot. She put her hand on his arm again briefly. I hope you find it, Kenneth. Someone who sees what you are and doesn't waste it. He nodded. Thank you, Donna. She moved toward the bread section. He stood in the produce aisle for a moment with his basket in his hand and a bunch of kale he'd been holding when she found him. He put the kale in the basket, went and got the chicken thighs, drove back to Decatur. Northbridge Distribution called him on a Tuesday in late March. George White, which was unusual, because George typically communicated through doorways and loaded glances and selective consumption of baked goods rather than telephone calls. Operations supervisor position opened up. HR posted it Monday. I told them you were the person. They want a formal application and an interview, which is administrative nonsense, because everyone in that building knows who's doing the work. But process is process. A pause. You're doing it. That's not really a question. No. What's the salary? 61,000. He sat with that number, 61,000, which was more than he'd made in a single year in all 5 jobs combined. Not by much, but some, and it was one job. One regular job with one set of hours and presumably one building he had to be in at a time. I'll send the application today. It's already submitted. I put your name in Monday. Not a flicker of apology. Application was a formality. Interviews Friday. Kenneth thought about how to respond to a man who had submitted your job application on your behalf without asking. Thank you, George. Bay 4 manifest is still wrong, by the way. I'll look at it when I come in, see that you do. The interview was, as George had promised, a formality. The HR manager asked him standard questions that he answered, clearly and without embellishment, and the VP of operations asked him one technical question about inventory system integration that he answered so specifically that she stopped writing midway through his response to look at him directly. And the whole thing lasted 42 minutes. He had the offer letter by end of day Friday. He called his parents that evening. Clarence answered. Kenneth told him about the position. His father said, I knew that was coming. How? Because you're good at the work, and because the people around you can see it even when you're not paying attention to it. A pause, brief and warm in the specific way Clarence's pauses were warm. You're going to be fine, son. He already knew that, but it was different to hear it. He quit the data entry job on Monday, wrote a professional and appreciative email and received a professional and appreciative response, and that was that. He kept the rideshare driving, one Friday night a month, not for the money, because he liked it. He liked the small sealed world of it, the temporary and complete nature of other people's destinations, the way you could help someone get somewhere and then return to your own trajectory without any further entanglement. He kept the freelance design, because he'd always kept it, because he was good at it. Because ochre and cream on a well-considered logo was a small, clean thing with a beginning and a middle and an end, and he liked those. The operations supervisor role started the first Monday in April. He woke that morning at 5:45 without needing the alarm, the old body habit still there, but the urgency removed from it. He made coffee, got dressed in the new suit, which he'd decided was the suit he wore on days that mattered. He drove to Northbridge, parked in the supervisor lot, which was 8 spaces closer to the building than the general lot, which was a completely trivial perk that he found unreasonably satisfying. George White was at the loading bay. He looked at Kenneth, looked at the parking space, looked back at Kenneth. About time, he said. Then he handed Kenneth a manifest, Bay 4, and they went to work. The $52,000 from Selena's first installment arrived in his account 11 weeks after the hearing, 3 days before the 90-day deadline, which he chose to read as Eric King's influence on the timeline rather than any voluntary promptness from Selena. He transferred it into a savings account he'd opened in February, named the account only with a number, not a label, because he didn't want to put a meaning on it that would change what it was. It was money he'd earned by working and lost through fraud, and recovered through documentation and patience and a lawyer who understood that paperwork was a form of truth. He was going to leave it alone for a while. He was going to let it exist without deciding what it meant. On a Sunday evening in late April, he drove the Grant Park apartment he'd moved into the previous week and carried up 3 boxes and a guitar and a coffee maker that was better than the last one, and not yet organized, and stood in the main room with the late light coming through windows that faced east, and thought about what it meant to be beginning something rather than ending it. The apartment had 2 rooms. He was using both. The second one was going to be a design studio eventually. Not yet, but eventually. He had a desk he'd bought from the estate sale listing he'd found on Craigslist, a solid mid-century thing in warm walnut that had enough surface area to spread out. He'd brought the desk up first. He placed the black notebook on the desk, picked up the pen, wrote his last entry, the one he was writing not to process but to close. The thing I learned that I didn't expect to learn is that keeping records isn't just about documentation. It's a form of respect for what actually happened. You don't get to decide what's true, but you can refuse to let the false version stand uncontested. That's what the 3 folders were. That's what the 52,000 represents. Not everything I put in, but enough to say, this happened, and it was documented, and someone with authority looked at the documentation and agreed. He paused. Then I spent 3 years working for something I thought was real. It wasn't, but the work was real. The discipline was real. The 5 a.m. alarms and the walks to work, and the design files sent at midnight, and the receipts kept in the locked drawer. All real. And those things are mine. They didn't belong to the marriage, they belonged to me. He put the pen down, looked at the east-facing windows. Then he picked up the guitar, played E minor into G slow, then faster. The calluses on his left hand had built up enough now that the chord changes didn't interrupt him. He played through the progression 3 times, 4 times, the rhythm starting to find something that resembled intention. Not good yet, but getting better. Which was, as it turned out, exactly enough.